Crossmaglen, South Armagh. November 17th, 1972. 1:42 a.m. Captain Robert Hayes of the U.S. Army Advisory Group lowered his binoculars slowly and frowned. Something about the British position below didn't make sense. There were no floodlights slicing the darkness. No towers crowned with machine guns. No obvious wire obstacles glinting under the moon. Just a low, uneven shape in the countryside, barely distinguishable from the surrounding hedgerows. "That's it?" he asked quietly. The British liaison officer beside him, Major Andrew Collins of the Parachute Regiment, nodded. "That's it." Hayes shifted his weight uncomfortably. The base, if it could even be called that, sat less than 2 kilometers from an area that intelligence reports described as IRA-dominated territory. South Armagh wasn't just hostile ground. It was considered one of the most dangerous operational zones in Western Europe. By American standards, the position was indefensible. The U.S. forward operating sites Hayes was familiar with, whether in Vietnam or later advisory visits, followed a predictable logic: visible dominance. Wire, concrete, height, light, firepower. This British post had none of that. No perimeter lighting? Hayes asked. No cleared fields of fire? No guard towers? Collins smiled faintly. "We have all of those," he said. "Just not where you can see them." Hayes wasn't reassured. From his vantage point, the British base looked less like a military installation and more like an abandoned farm complex. A few low buildings. Vehicles parked under camouflage nets. No obvious movement. If an attack came, Hayes thought, it would be over in minutes. What he didn't know, what most visiting officers failed to grasp, was that by late 1972, British units operating in South Armagh were suffering a fraction of the successful attacks experienced by comparable foreign or local forces using conventional-based defense. And when attacks did occur, they almost never reached the perimeter. The defenses weren't missing. They were simply elsewhere. When British forces deployed in strength to Northern Ireland in 1969, many senior planners leaned instinctively on lessons learned from World War II and conventional Cold War thinking. Secure bases, visible authority, strong points. Early installations reflected this mindset. Fortified police stations, army posts surrounded by wire, sandbags, watchtowers, and bright lights intended to deter attack. Instead, they became magnets. Captain Hayes had read the reports. Static bases attracted surveillance. Surveillance enabled planning. Planning enabled precision attacks. The provisional IRA didn't assault blindly. They watched. They measured response times. They studied guard routines, light cycles, sentry changes, resupply schedules. The more visible a base became, the more predictable it was. Between 1970 and 1971, heavily fortified positions in border regions experienced a steady rise in attacks. Mortars, sniper fire, vehicle bombs. The defenses held, technically, but the enemy always seemed to know exactly where to strike. The officers who questioned this approach weren't theorists. They were veterans. Men who had fought in places where visibility was a liability. Malaya, Borneo, Kenya. Conflicts where the enemy lived among the terrain, moved quietly, and punished any force that advertised its location. Brigadier Thomas Llewellyn, who assumed command of forces in South Armagh in 1971, had served as a young officer during the Malayan emergency. He remembered the early failures. "We built forts," he later wrote, and then wondered why the enemy kept turning up at the gates. In Malaya, British forces had learned, slowly and painfully, that jungle warfare punished static defense. Clearing ground helped attackers more than defenders. Lights blinded sentries more than infiltrators. Wire fixed attention on the perimeter while the enemy operated freely beyond it. The solution hadn't been better fortifications. It had been ownership of ground. Llewellyn quietly began changing how bases were conceived. Posts became smaller, lower, harder to identify. Cleared ground shrank instead of expanded. Lighting was reduced, then eliminated. Observation moved outward. Rather than building obvious defensive lines, British units saturated the surrounding area with constant, irregular patrolling. Not sweeping patrols. Not show-of-force movements. Small teams. At night. On foot. Moving slowly through hedgerows, ditches, farms, and tree lines. Listening posts replaced towers. Ambushes replaced checkpoints. The perimeter ceased to be a line. It became a zone. Captain Michael Harrington of the Royal Green Jackets explained it bluntly to an American observer. If they can watch us, they can hit us. So we make sure they never get close enough to watch. IRA reconnaissance teams quickly discovered something was wrong. Approaches that had once been safe suddenly weren't. Men sent to observe British posts failed to return. No shots. No explosions. They simply vanished. One captured volunteer later described it during interrogation. We thought they were hiding in the base. But they weren't. They were already outside it. British patrols didn't wait for attacks. They hunted surveillance. Any individual loitering too long. Any vehicle passing repeatedly. Any unusual movement at night. Contact, when it occurred, happened far from the base, often without warning. By mid-1972, IRA operational reports began warning units to avoid prolonged observation of certain British positions. They were labeled dark posts, not because they lacked lighting, but because nothing could be seen near them without consequence. Captain Hayes learned none of this on his first night overlooking Crossmaglen. What he saw was emptiness. What he didn't see were 6 British patrols already moving through the countryside. Listening posts positioned over a kilometer out. Pre-registered artillery and mortar targets mapped onto likely approach routes. Men who had walked the same ground for months and could identify disturbances by smell, sound, and instinct. The base wasn't the center of defense. It was merely where supplies were kept. At 2:13 a.m., Hayes noticed Collins glance at his watch. Something? Hayes asked. Movement, Collins replied calmly. 2, maybe 3. Southeast hedgerow. Hayes raised his binoculars. He saw nothing. 20 minutes later, Collins received a brief radio transmission. Just a few words. No urgency. Contact resolved, Collins said. Hayes swallowed. How? Quietly. The night remained undisturbed. No flares. No gunfire. No alarm. The British post slept on. And somewhere beyond the dark fields of South Armagh, another reconnaissance attempt had ended before it could begin. By 1973, the contrast between British dark posts and conventional fortified installations had become impossible to ignore. Units operating from large, visible bases continued to draw attention. Even when attacks failed, the enemy learned. Each probe refined their understanding of reaction times, firing arcs, and blind spots. British units operating from low-profile posts experienced something different. Silence. Weeks would pass without a single serious incident near certain positions. Yet intelligence reports showed no reduction in enemy activity in the wider area. The conflict hadn't stopped. It had simply shifted away from British-controlled ground. Lieutenant Colonel James Foster, commanding a battalion in South Armagh, summarized it in a staff briefing. They're still here. They're just not stupid enough to come near us. This wasn't luck. It was consequence. The IRA depended on reconnaissance. Without it, operations stalled. Every attack required weeks of preparation, mapping routines, identifying escape routes, confirming safe houses. British doctrine targeted that process. Patrols were not random. They were designed to overlap, intersect, and change rhythm constantly. Routes were altered nightly. Timings shifted without pattern. Most critically, British patrols did not withdraw at dawn. They stayed. IRA units accustomed to operating freely at night found themselves under threat at all hours. A scout moving through a familiar field could no longer assume safety just because the sun was rising. Sergeant Alan Price, a patrol commander, explained the effect. They couldn't tell where we'd be next, so they started moving less. When they moved less, they stopped being effective. Captured documents confirmed this. A 1973 internal IRA memorandum warned volunteers. Extended surveillance near British installations has become high risk. Units are to minimize time spent observing fixed locations. Losses are unacceptable. Losses wasn't propaganda. It was accounting. On the night of August 9, 1973, a local IRA unit attempted to conduct a limited mortar attack against a British position near Forkhill. It never reached firing position. At 22:40, a British listening post detected movement over 900 meters from the base. By 22:55, 2 patrols had maneuvered into blocking positions. Contact occurred at 23:03. The exchange lasted less than 30 seconds. The IRA unit broke contact immediately, abandoning equipment and withdrawing in disarray. 2 volunteers were later confirmed killed. No British casualties were reported. The base itself remained untouched. What was significant wasn't the skirmish, it was the distance. The engagement occurred so far from the post that many soldiers inside the base never realized anything had happened. The perimeter had moved outward again. Visiting officers from allied nations struggled to understand what they were seeing. There were no elaborate defensive diagrams, no layered wire obstacles, no permanent kill zones. British officers couldn't produce neat blueprints because the defense wasn't static. It lived in habits, experience, and familiarity with ground. American advisors noted the absence of formalized structure and often misinterpreted it as improvisation. In reality, it was discipline. Major Collins addressed this misunderstanding directly during a joint briefing. "You're looking for the wall. We're focused on the space beyond it." This approach had roots deeper than Northern Ireland. British units had refined it over decades of counterinsurgency, where visibility equaled vulnerability and predictability meant death. They had learned that fortifications reassured soldiers, but reassured the enemy even more. By late 1973, analysts began compiling statistics that mirrored earlier counterinsurgency campaigns. British posts employing low-profile, patrol-centric defense experienced fewer successful attacks, lower casualty rates during base defense, higher enemy losses during reconnaissance attempts. In some sectors, successful enemy actions dropped by over 60% compared to earlier fortified positions. Just as telling was the shift in enemy behavior. IRA units began rerouting operations around British-controlled zones, even when those zones contained key terrain. It wasn't that the British were stronger everywhere. They were simply too dangerous to observe. The greatest impact wasn't physical. It was psychological. For the enemy, uncertainty replaced planning. Every movement risked contact. Every observation risked disappearance. Every delay increased exposure. One former IRA member later admitted during debriefing, "You never knew if you were already being watched. That gets into your head. You stop trusting the ground." British soldiers noticed the change. Patrols reported fewer signs of enemy presence. Safe houses went unused. Supply routes shifted away. The conflict didn't end, but initiative changed hands. Captain Hayes, the American advisor, stayed in South Armagh for 6 months. His initial skepticism faded quietly. He stopped asking where the wire was, stopped looking for towers, stopped expecting lights. Instead, he began counting patrols. Not the ones he could see, but the ones he couldn't. Before departing, Hayes wrote in his final assessment, "British base security is not centered on physical barriers. It is achieved through continuous dominance of surrounding terrain. The base is not defended directly. The enemy's ability to approach it is destroyed." It wasn't a revolutionary idea. It was simply one most modern armies had forgotten. By 1974, similar methods were quietly influencing British operations elsewhere. In Oman, in later Falklands preparations, in future deployments where small forces faced adaptive enemies. The lesson remained consistent. Static defense invites study. Study enables attack. Denies study, and attacks collapse before they begin. The British hadn't built stronger walls. They'd removed the target altogether. By the mid-1970s, the pattern was no longer deniable, even to those who disliked admitting it. British forces operating from low-visibility positions were not winning because they were untouchable, but because they were unreadable. The enemy could not build a plan against what he could not measure. Every counterinsurgency campaign eventually reduces itself to that equation. Whoever controls information controls initiative. Whoever controls initiative dictates violence. British commanders did not describe their bases as secure. They described them as uninteresting. That distinction mattered. A secure base still invited curiosity. An uninteresting one starved it. The IRA's operational tempo in areas dominated by British patrol-centric defense slowed noticeably. Not stopped, not destroyed, but constrained. Attacks required more preparation, more risk, more time. Each of those costs accumulated. A single lost scout delayed an operation by weeks. A failed reconnaissance forced a complete replan. A compromised route meant abandoning weapons already cached. Over time, efficiency degraded. British patrol reports from 1974 onward increasingly referenced enemy avoidance rather than engagement. Movement detected at distance, then altered. Signals intercepted suggesting rerouting. Areas once active fell quiet, not because the enemy was gone, but because operating there had become irrational. The irony was that British bases themselves became almost irrelevant to daily operations. They were no longer the focal point of security planning. Soldiers spent more time away from them than inside. When attacks did occur, they were usually indirect, imprecise, and quickly abandoned. The enemy fired to remind, not to destroy. This inversion confused outside observers. Analysts accustomed to counting attacks as indicators of success misread the data. Fewer attacks looked like stalemate. In reality, fewer attacks reflected fewer opportunities. The ground had become hostile to the attacker. Years later, during internal reviews, British officers struggled to translate their experience into neat doctrine. There were no diagrams that captured intuition, no checklist that replicated patience. What worked depended on men staying in place long enough to learn ground intimately, on units remaining cohesive long enough to think collectively, on accepting discomfort in exchange for advantage. Those were not qualities easily exported. As conflicts evolved and technology advanced, some of these lessons were temporarily forgotten. Surveillance drones replaced scouts. Sensors replaced listening posts. Databases replaced memory. Yet whenever opponents adapted, whenever they learned to evade machines rather than men, the same old truths resurfaced. Static positions still attracted attention. Predictable routines still invited exploitation. And territory still belonged to whoever knew it best. Captain Hayes returned home convinced he had witnessed something fundamental rather than situational. In later years, advising younger officers, he would summarize it simply. The British didn't defend bases. They defended ignorance. The enemy never knew enough to try. That idea resurfaced decades later in deserts and mountains far from Ireland. Patrol bases without fences. Observation posts without lights. Units living among the terrain rather than atop it. Different uniforms. Different wars. Same logic. The most effective defenses were not walls, but habits. In South Armagh, long after the conflict faded, locals would still speak of certain areas with unease. Fields where movement felt watched. Roads where engines slowed without conscious reason. Places that remembered footsteps. Those were not monuments. They were residues of control. British forces eventually withdrew, not because their method failed, but because political conditions changed. Yet, even as they left, the legacy remained clear in captured documents and post-conflict testimony. The enemy had never solved the problem of the dark posts. They had simply waited for time to solve it for them. The final lesson was neither tactical nor technical. It was psychological. When a force convinces its enemy that observation equals death, attack becomes optional. When attack becomes optional, pressure dissolves. When pressure dissolves, the conflict bends, not through decisive battles, but through accumulated doubt. The British never built fortresses that dominated the skyline. They built uncertainty that dominated the mind. And in wars like these, that was enough.